Okay. Thank you. Dear colleagues, students, and guests, I would like to welcome you to the 6th and last lecture in this lecture series that the Faculty of Arts and Sciences has organized to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Robert College and Boğaziçi University. And I would very much like to thank Professor Gutas for accepting our invitation to be a part of this series. Thank you very much. I think that it's very important that all of us on this campus know something about the history of our institution. So, as I have in previous lectures done, let me start with a few words about this history. For those of you who may have heard part of it before, I am sorry for the repetition. The idea of Robert College began on the suggestion of two brothers, James and William Dwight, sons of Dr. Otis Dwight, a pioneer researcher of the Near East for American missionary effort. Their intention was to establish a secular institution of higher learning in Istanbul, entirely separate from the American missionary colony in the Ottoman Empire. A noted New York merchant and philanthropist of Christian causes, Christopher Rhinelander Robert, agreed to supply the funds, and the mission of establishing the institution was given to Cyrus Hamlin, the director of Bebek Seminary, a man with long experience in missionary education in the Ottoman Empire, but with his own practical and pragmatic approach to education. The idea came from the Dwight brothers, the money from Robert, and the energy, the oversight, and the actual implementation from Hamlin. And what emerged was definitely not a missionary school, and certainly not a secular school, but a school basing itself on liberal New England educational principles led by individuals with strong Christian values, and the college opened its doors in 1863 to Bulgarian, Armenian, Greek, and other minorities living in the Ottoman Empire. The integration of the college into the larger Turkish educational scene possibly begins with the graduation of the first Turkish student, Hüseyin Pektaş, in 1903. As Professor Freely told us the other day, he was certainly not the first student. There were some students, but he is the first one to graduate. That year, there were 320 students from 14 different ethnic and religious backgrounds, and of this number, only 6 were Turks. During the next 30 years, the enrollment went up to 750, and the proportion of Turks rose to more than 50%. A major contribution to the integration came from the establishment of the engineering school in 1912, and by the early 1950s, the college had firmly established its prestige in Turkey in general, and with the increasing demand, 2 new faculties, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and the Business School, was added in 1959. Established in a tumultuous time and at the center of the world, as the college soon began, the college survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the fall of an empire, and witnessed the foundation of a new republic, and throughout all which it never closed its doors for a single day. When it celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1963, the college had reached its widest state of extension, with a women's college on the Arnavutköy campus and the men's high school and university on the Bebek campus. However, for all its continued growth and success, the history of Robert College was haunted always with one major recurring theme: the shortage of funds. And in 1970, when it was financially impossible to keep it going in its extended structure, the Board of Trustees decided to keep a co-ed high school on the Arnavutköy campus and to hand this campus and the mission of university education to the Turkish state. So was born Boğaziçi University in 1971. Since then, Boğaziçi University has grown to be a much larger institution with more than 13,000 students, about 500 faculty members, a large graduate school, 4 faculties, 4 institutions, a vocational school, and in its 42 years, established a reputation of its own as the leading university in Turkey. But it has never broken its ties with its past, the heritage of Robert College, and the fact that it grew out of Robert College continues to leave its mark, to inspire its direction, and to guide its development into the future. I hope you will agree that this lecture series, in the variety of its offerings and the excellence of its content, has been fitting contribution to the continuation of this tradition. I now invite the Chair of History Department, Professor Necipoğlu, to introduce our speaker, Professor Gutas, today. Thank you very much for coming.
Dear Dean, dear colleagues, dear students, distinguished guests. It gives me great honor and pleasure to present to you our speaker this afternoon, Professor Dimitri Gutas, Professor of Arabic and Greco-Arabic Studies at Yale University's Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. When our dear Dean, Professor Gülen Aktaş, asked the Department of History to nominate a world-renowned scholar to be invited to the Faculty of Arts and Sciences lecture series organized as part of the ongoing 150th anniversary celebrations this year, our department thought that the perfect person to invite for this meaningful occasion would be Dimitri Gutas, an Istanbuliot, a graduate of Robert College, and the leading scholar of his own field. And we are very grateful that he has kindly accepted our invitation despite his extremely busy schedule. It's not an easy task to present Professor Gutas, whose accomplishments are so many that even the short version of his CV contains too many pages to extract information from. So I'll do my best in trying to be selective. After graduating from Robert College in 1965, and I understand that there are several classmates of his today in this room, Dimitri Gutas went to Yale, where he did his undergraduate and graduate work in classics, history of religions, and Arabic and Islamic studies. 2 years after receiving his PhD degree in 1974, he joined the faculty of Yale, where he taught as assistant and associate professor till 1985. Between 1985 and 89, he took up a new teaching post as professor of Arabic and Islamic studies at the University of Crete in Rethymnon, which is in fact where I met Dimitri Gutas, if I may just squeeze in a little personal detail. In 1989, he returned to Yale and as professor and has since been teaching there. Professor Gutas has been studying and teaching classical Arabic and the pre-modern Islamic intellectual tradition from a number of different aspects. At the center of his concerns lie the study of Arabic in its many forms as a prerequisite for the proper understanding of the written sources that inform us about the history and culture of Islamic societies. He has also been interested in the transmission of Greek scientific and philosophical works into the Islamic world through the famous Greco-Arabic translation movement in Baghdad during the 8th and 10th centuries. And these interests have resulted in his long-standing project, a collaborative project, together with Professor Endres of Bochum University, to compile a Greek and Arabic lexicon being published by Brill from 1992 onwards and subtitled Materials for a Dictionary of the Medieval Arabic Translations from Greek into Arabic. Apart from his lexicographical interests, Professor Gutas has devoted a large part of his work to the edition and study of Greek philosophical texts translated into Arabic and their influence in the Islamic world. The significance of the Greco-Arabic translation movement for Arabic letters and for Islamic civilization in general has led Professor Gutas also to examine its position in the social history of the early Abbasid Caliphate in which it took place. This has resulted in the publication in 1998 of his celebrated book, Greek Thought, Arabic Culture, which has been translated into 8 languages, including Turkish. The book investigates the major social, political, and ideological factors that gave rise to the translation movement. And currently, Gutas is engaged in a new study on translations from and into Greek, Syriac, Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin from the Hellenistic period to the Renaissance. Finally, Dimitri Gutas has spent another part of his, major part of his scholarly career on the study of the Arabic philosophical tradition as it was affected by the Greek philosophical texts translated into Arabic during the translation movement. He is indeed an authority, in particular, on Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna or Avicenna in the medieval Latin world, on whom he has written the fundamental book, Avicenna and the Aristotelian Tradition, published by Brill in 1988, and the second revised and augmented edition of which has come out just this year, or is about to come out, is forthcoming, is just about to come out in 2013. I should also mention his book in Turkish, Ibn Sina'nın Mirası, The Heritage of Ibn Sina, published in Istanbul in 2010. There are, of course, many more publications, but I will not go into them, both books and articles. But let me just mention that Dimitri Gutas, of course, has been an invited speaker in many, many countries and universities worldwide. And back in 2009, when we heard that he was coming to Istanbul for the first time after more than 40 years, to deliver some lectures at Sabancı University, I must confess that I had felt somewhat envious. And so it gives me great pleasure today on this meaningful occasion to invite Professor Gutas to the floor to deliver his lecture entitled The Conquest of Knowledge, Translation and Civilization from Alexander the Great to Mehmed the Conqueror. So the floor is yours, Professor Gutas.
Dear Dean, colleagues, friends, arkadaşlar, former wonderful reminders of a life spent in absolute joy in this campus, doing what, of course, this school has been doing best, teaching and investigating knowledge. Schools are the most human of all institutions. They are the most human of all institutions because they engage in the most human of all activities, knowledge. As our ancient philosophers say, the virtue of something is the function for which it has been created to do, or whose essence it is. And what distinguishes us as humans is that we have knowledge. We have reason, we have speech, and we have knowledge. And from that point of view, schools, by practicing knowledge, discovering it, passing it on, and cultivating it, are the most human of all institutions. This particular institution, whose 150th year we are celebrating this year, as so wonderfully described by Dean Gülen Aktaş, is indeed one of the bright points in human civilization throughout all the centuries. And it is a great, deep honor for me to be here to help you celebrate this wonderful occasion. Thank you very much to the Faculty of Arts and Sciences of YGG, to Dean Gülen Aktaş, to the History Department, and to all the colleagues for this wonderful invitation and this reception. On a personal note, of course, I'm doubly delighted because, as I said, I'm visiting these old grounds, hallowed grounds, where I first learned to love and appreciate knowledge, thus being true to what Aristotle described in his famous first lines of the Metaphysics. I'll talk about Aristotle later, so I can bring him in here. All men by nature desire to know. I'm delighted that I am here to celebrate the 150th anniversary, since I was also here to celebrate the 100th anniversary in 1963 as a junior, I think, at the time in high school. So so it is therefore my great pleasure again also as an individual to come back and perhaps try to spread a little bit of what I started acquiring here. And indeed, I will talk about knowledge and its transmission throughout the centuries. It is, in fact, a book in gestation right now, which Nevra mentioned, and I hope I should be able to bring it to fruition pretty soon, and I will try and give you a basic idea about its contents. Now, in the intellectual history of the world west of India, which is how the West is historically to be understood, the West is everything west of India, and from Hellenistic times to the end of the 15th century, that is from Alexander the Great to Sultan Mehmed Fatih, the conqueror, no single agent was more instrumental in fueling the motor of civilization, the production and transmission of knowledge, than translation. Throughout this period, there were translations, to mention the most prevalent languages, from Greek into Latin, Syriac and Arabic, from Syriac into Arabic, from Sanskrit into Middle Persian, and from Middle Persian into Arabic, from Arabic into Latin, Hebrew, and back into Greek, from Hebrew into Latin, and from Latin into Hebrew and Greek. Because the knowledge that was transmitted, science and philosophy, which I will call science for short, because for the period with which we are concerned, they were indeed the same thing, had the same contents. For this period, science was something that was a source of power and dominance to its possessor, but also a supreme good in itself. Translation as a social movement was a highly political act, and the transmission itself was a conquest, as its course related closely to military and political developments throughout this long period. A survey of the development of Western civilization from this vantage point, which I will try briefly to present today, reveals the inner workings, the clockwork, so to speak, of history in explicit and fascinating terms. The reason that translation affords such a royal avenue to the inner workings of history is that its study involves both our intellects and our emotions, whose respective influence on how we know history it forces us to investigate, and thus leads us to the very core of method in historiography. Let me explain. On the side of our intellects, we can readily perceive that translation is a deceptively simple term about which we must think seriously unless we want to be deceived. While the actual process of it, rendering one text from the source to the target language, is easily understandable, everything else about it is complicated and in need of explanation. First, it must be realized that by translation, we refer to translation as a social movement to which a society, or the leading classes of a society, are programmatically committed, and not to a random research interest of a few eccentric scholars who might indulge in arcane and ultimately historically irrelevant philological pursuits in any age or time. Then we have to answer the following fundamental questions. When and where translation took place, who translated how and why, what texts were chosen to be translated, who demanded and used translations, and why, and the social and historical causes, purpose, consequences, and significance of translation. And if translation is a key factor in the development of Western civilization, as I just described, then the difficulty of understanding it precisely, but also the importance and necessity of doing so, can be easily grasped. For the answers to all these questions about translation I enumerated presuppose that we understand which individuals or which social groups or classes made what kind of decisions for what purposes and on what basis, the stuff of historical process itself. On the side of our emotions, it can be immediately realized that the study of translation is also a sensitive subject. Translation inevitably means translation from one language to another. And language, more than anything else, is what constitutes ethnic identity. Talking, therefore, about translation of knowledge from one language to the other means the transmission of this universally acknowledged supreme good from one ethnic group to the other, with all the implications of superiority and inferiority, originality and dependence that such a transmission has been almost just as universally, but certainly most mistakenly, also taken to entail. Translation, therefore, taken at its deceptively simple face value, without the answers to the questions that must necessarily qualify it, can be and has been taken to mean the superiority of one ethnic group over another. At that simplistic level, the source language of the translated text, and hence the ethnic group speaking it, being thought to be original, is considered superior, and the target language, and hence the ethnic group speaking it, is considered derivative and inferior. Accordingly, the approach that discusses the history of the transmission of knowledge must treat this sensitive subject in a way that will avoid making winners and losers in the resulting account. The beauty contest approach to history I will mention below, without sacrificing, of course, historical accuracy. The challenge is thus to adopt the proper method that is both true to the historical record and humanistic, that is objective, as opposed to much historiography that is surreptitiously ethnocentric and religiously slanted. The reason is that the historical consciousness of people in contemporary Western societies has been formed by a historiography serving the ideology of the nation-state. The dominant narrative of the rise of the West in popular consciousness and the way it is overwhelmingly taught in secondary schools, if not always in scholarly work, to this very day has been the following sequence. Civilization was created by the genius of the Greeks, and then it passed on to the Romans. Then it went into hibernation through a long period called the Dark Ages, following which it was reborn in the Italian Renaissance, but then it abandoned Southern Europe and continued in Northern and Western Europe until it reached us, including the USA, as a Yale colleague put it a few years ago when he was asked to define Western civilization. This will not do. The development of science and civilization in the West, at the core of which lies the fact of translation, needs to be studied from a historical point of view that avoids ethnocentricity, religious triumphalism, and ultimately racism. To put it bluntly, but perhaps most expressively, historiography is not a beauty contest in which an ethnic group or religion wins or must be shown to win as the most beautiful girl wearing a sash with the name of her country on it. Because in the historical study of these subjects, one ethnic or religious group is not better or superior to the other because it is that particular ethnic or religious group, you can fill in the blanks of whatever group you prefer, but because of concrete historical circumstances defined by time, place, and social and political context that made those particular groups that spoke a certain language or belonged to a particular religion accomplish what they did in civilizational terms. Each people and society are not given a history because they are this or that ethnic group or religion. The history they get is the history they create as a society. The traditions and beliefs that are prevalent in each society play a role in the formation of that history, but not as impersonal or essential and eternal agents determining the historical process from above, but rather as ideologies wielded by those in power for specific purposes and ends. To understand translation and its role in the development of Western civilization, it is advisable to study the many peoples that participated in this historical process from this perspective. I will start with Aristotle, because the former curriculum of scientific knowledge, which lends cultural unity to this vast area west of India for 18 centuries, was essentially formed by him. Aristotle himself, of course, was not born fully formed, springing like the goddess Athena from the head of Zeus, but represents the culmination of developments in intellectual history that are the result of the colonization by the Greek city-states of much of Asia Minor and southern Italy, the intense contact and exchange of the Greeks with the peoples in the Middle East, a subject has been gratefully much cultivated recently, and the formation of various forms of government in the Greek city-states, including the democratic, with the attendant effect which this political organization had on the generation of knowledge by social classes not beholden or controlled by centralized political power. However, Aristotle represents a turning point in intellectual history for at least two reasons. His generation of philosophers in Athens, with him leading the way, developed the literary form of the treatise, written in expository prose as the means to communicate science. Before him, philosophers in Ionia and Italy expressed themselves either in gnomic pronouncements or in poetry. And in Athens, of course, Socrates wrote nothing, communicating his ideas orally in speeches, and while Plato, in the next generation, who did commit his philosophy to writing, wrote dialogues in imitation of the oral exchange. It was only with Aristotle's generation that Athenian society became broadly literate in the sense that the scientific treatise could be read by any citizen without having to be in the company of Socrates or Plato to gain access to this knowledge. Second, Aristotle developed not only the form of the treatise, but also the contents. He was the first to see the different fields of science, some of which he himself created, as interrelated to form all human knowledge, which was then to be pursued with a scientific method that he also created, syllogistic logic. This curriculum was fully developed by the 4th century AD in Greek on the basis laid by Aristotle, and largely as the outcome of the attempts to classify his works, which were seen to encompass all knowledge. The curriculum consisted of a method, logic, and two substantive fields, the theoretical and practical sciences. The theoretical sciences were subdivided into natural science, including physics, cosmology, meteorology, chemistry, biology, the natural sciences. Mathematics was called the quadrivium, the four sciences of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, and metaphysics, while the practical sciences were divided to ethics, management of the estate or household management, and politics. This entire scientific curriculum, with whatever ancillary subjects and disciplines were eventually incorporated in it, like medicine as a derivative science in natural philosophy, and including most of the extant works of Aristotle, was essentially the knowledge that was eventually conquered through translation empire in the West until the Renaissance. But this may not have happened immediately after Aristotle, were it not for our hero here, Alexander the Great, in this most amazing historical synchronicity of the greatest philosopher with the greatest conqueror. Alexander, of course, did not conquer this knowledge. He already had it at home with his teacher, Aristotle, but he conquered the world where written knowledge could be institutionalized and establish itself. Aristotle's pro-Macedonian political proclivities, something on account of which he had to leave Athens just a year before his death, fearing that the virulently anti-Macedonian Athenians might execute him for his political beliefs, just like Socrates, resulted in his disciples' active involvement in the politics, cultural or otherwise, of the successor state of Alexander in Egypt, the Ptolemies. Aristotle and his disciples had created a library in Aristotle's school in Athens, the Lyceum, which housed all their treatises. With the establishment of the Ptolemies in Egypt, the disciples prevailed upon Ptolemy I, he died 282 BC, to build the library that would house all knowledge, which he did, with the well-known results. Ptolemy himself was a scholar of sorts. He wrote a history of Alexander, but this is irrelevant. He could not, just as no ruler after him could, be blind to the semiotic significance of joining political power with intellectual power, knowledge. He conquered knowledge and imprisoned it, or saved it, in the library, thus setting a precedent and an emblem of power that was to be followed by all rulers down the centuries. In the Greek-speaking areas generated by the conquest of Alexander, the sciences were cultivated in Greek by all peoples who participated in the Hellenistic Commonwealth. Non-Greek speakers to the west and east of the Ptolemies and Seleucids in Syria conquered knowledge in different ways. To the west, Greek letters completely dominated Latin culture and formed the foundation of whatever disciplines were launched in Latin. Horace's astute observation has been much discussed and documented when he said, "Conquered Greece, the feral victor conquered and with her arts invaded brutish Rome." The metaphor of conquest, to express the appropriation of the sciences and the arts from the literally conquered people, dominated Latin letters, and it indicates the cultural attitude of the Romans who viewed this transferal of knowledge as rightfully gained spoils of war. Nothing illustrates this better than the story, which could serve as a motto to my Conquest of Knowledge project, of the theft, literal theft of Aristotle's books, his private library itself, by the Roman dictator Sulla. The fate of Aristotle's library is intriguing in itself and well worth telling, but I'm afraid I have no time for it. Suffice it to say that after many peregrinations, the library came back to Athens by the beginning of the 1st century BC. But in 88 BC, Athens, along with some other Greek cities, rebelled against Roman rule and fought to gain their independence. The Roman dictator Sulla sacked the city in 86 BC, found Aristotle's library there, and literally carried it off to Rome. To the victor belonged the spoils. Later in the 1st century BC, Cicero, who was by far the best importer of Greek knowledge into Latin, expressed this attitude well in a passage that was to be quoted centuries later by Boethius in the early 6th century, another translator from Greek. Cicero said, "Even in its best days, Greek philosophy would never have been held in such high honor if the rivalries and disagreements of its chief exponents had not maintained its activity. For this reason, I encourage all those who have the capacity to wrest from now languishing Greece this sort of glory won from philosophy and transfer it to this city, Rome, just as our ancestors by their indefatigable zeal transferred here all the other glories that are worth striving for." End of quotation. It is important to note that we observe here the commodification of culture and knowledge and see the transfer interpreted and evaluated as transfer of power and glory. In other words, culture and knowledge are reified as something that can be physically taken in order to enhance the glory, power, and self-esteem of the takers and to make them equal in rank or better than the plundered people. This commodification of knowledge and the attendant attitude about its plunder can be seen in all instances of cultural transfer and make it a supremely political act, a major element in the power play that is the historical process. To the east of the Roman world, the Persian-speaking Sasanians elevated my thesis that empires conquer knowledge through translation to their formal state ideology. The Sasanian dynasty in Iran, which ruled from 226 AD until the Arab conquest in 642, portrayed itself as the successors and hence inheritors of the glory of the ancient Persian empire of the Achaemenids and their religion, Zoroastrianism. They developed their translation ideology as a reaction to the devastation of Alexander's conquests. This otherwise deplorable event, from the Persian point of view, was incorporated in a Sasanian imperial ideology which simultaneously glorified the dynasty itself and promoted the assimilation of Hellenism through translations from Greek into Middle Persian. As the pre-Islamic Zoroastrian book, the Denkard, has it, Alexander's conquest caused the Zoroastrian books of the Avesta, the ancient Iranian scriptures, to be scattered throughout the world and translated into other languages, giving rise to sciences everywhere. The Sasanians now undertook to collect these allegedly original Zoroastrian texts, now in Greek, as well as any other scientific books in other languages as well, and translate them back into Persian as a means of repatriating their knowledge, their heritage. In this fashion, science of all cultures was seen as deriving from Zoroastrianism, and hence translation represented the method of regaining what the Sasanians believed originally belonged to them. This culture of translation was officially sponsored by the Sasanian state, and it appears to have reached its high point of fruition during the reign of the Emperor Anushirwan during the 6th century AD. Now, ensconced between the Latin and Greek-speaking Romans in the West and the Persian-speaking Sasanians in the East, and subject to them both, were the Aramaic or Syriac-speaking native populations in the Near East who were Hellenized to various degrees under Seleucid and early Roman domination. With the advent of Christianity, Syriac speakers converted to the new faith relatively early, and in the first few centuries until the 5th, there is observed in their outlook an antagonistic attitude toward the Greek sciences, which is no doubt to be attributed to the similar attitude that can be observed in the early Christian Greek literature of the apologists and theologians. But after the 5th century, and in the wake of the Christological controversies, and in all likelihood because of them, the attitude changed to one of assimilation. And secular, that is pagan Greek learning, became thoroughly assimilated by Syriac speakers and well entrenched in the major centers of Eastern Christianity throughout the Fertile Crescent. Syriac scholars participated in the scientific tradition to the extent that they would do it in Greek, while some translation and commenting of Greek scientific texts was carried on before Islam. But this activity was primarily pedagogical in nature and reproductive of the curriculum, not creatively scientific. The lack of creative engagement by Syriac speakers with the ancient sciences and philosophy, despite their proficiency with the Greek language, has attracted attention for some time, and it was commented upon already by Ernest Renan in the middle of the 19th century. Historically, this can be seen as the outcome of the political lack of independence of the Syriac-speaking communities in the Near East. Whether under the Romans or the Sasanians before Islam, or under the Muslim Arabs after it, these communities were politically dependent on the major empires. As subject peoples and not conquerors themselves, there were generated no incentives or need for them to conquer knowledge comprehensively, and hence their cultural orientation was motivated mostly by their communal needs and ecclesiastical affiliation. Nevertheless, because of their disenfranchisement by anti-Hellenic Orthodox Christianity, and subsequently because of the relative doctrinal independence from it under the Muslims, they were also able to preserve knowledge about the curriculum of higher studies, and as well as the basic texts and the manuscripts that contain them. And it was overwhelmingly they who informed Arab sponsors about the contents of secular Greek learning and eventually executed the Greco-Arabic translations when commissioned by them later under the Abbasids. The realization that the conquest of the Near East also entailed conquest of knowledge came slowly to the Arabs, most likely because the major conflicts during the first century after the Hijrah were internecine. The nascent Islamic societies were completely engrossed with domestic problems at home and with military conquest abroad. But whatever the reason, and the first century after the Hijrah, as we know, has been a singularly problematic period to historians, by the end of the Umayyad rule in the mid-8th century, it was becoming apparent that the Arab tribal cultural context, which excluded input from outside, could not be maintained. And it is no coincidence that possibly the very first text to be translated into Arabic that before the end of the Umayyads was the alleged correspondence between Aristotle and Alexander, the two emblematic figures with which our cycle of empire and translation began. Soon thereafter, the victorious Abbasids came to power and initiated a far-reaching translation movement into Arabic from Sanskrit, Middle Persian, Syriac, and eventually and predominantly from Greek. This translation movement has its origins in the social policies and imperial ideology adopted by the early Abbasids, and especially by the originator of these policies, the second Caliph al-Mansur, who reigned from 754 to 775. The Abbasids came to power as the result of a civil war against the Umayyads, and al-Mansur faced the difficult task of reconciling the different interest groups that participated in the Abbasid cause and legitimizing the rule of his dynasty in their eyes. Because the Persian factions that were carriers of the pre-Islamic Sasanian culture were among the strongest supporters of the Abbasid revolution, al-Mansur expanded his imperial ideology to include their concerns. The view was accordingly promulgated that the Abbasid dynasty, in addition to being the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, were at the same time the successors of the ancient imperial dynasties in Mesopotamia, from the ancient Babylonians and the Achaemenids to the Sasanians. As the most effective means for the diffusion of this view, al-Mansur incorporated the translation culture of the Sassanians as part of his overall imperial ideology. Just as the universal knowledge indigenous to Iraq and Iran, Zoroastrianism, was believed to have been conquered by Alexander through its translation into Greek and subsequently repatriated to Iran in Middle Persian, so now the new dynasty of the Abbasids, destined by the stars to rule for a long time, would conquer the whole of it through translations into Arabic from all these languages. Al-Mansur's adoption of this aspect of Sassanid ideology and its culture of translation was among the major causes that initiated the Greco-Arabic translation movement in Baghdad and gave it official sanction. Other secondary factors were also at work at subsequent stages. Religious and political confrontation with Christians and Jews, as well as polemics against the Manichaeans, also played a significant role, as did al-Ma'mun's policies to centralize power in the hand of the caliph, and the needs of the developing group of scientists and scholars for more material. I have discussed these aspects in detail elsewhere, and I can explain later if need be. Here, I should note that the Greco-Arabic translation movement constituted the weightiest factor in the series of imperial conquests of knowledge and provided a reference point and model for its further continuation. Now going to the West. In the West, in the Latin-speaking world, although there had been sporadic translation activities from Arabic into Latin before the 12th century, such activities became a historically significant movement only in the 12th century in Spain, in the Iberian Peninsula. The Latins were quite aware of the cultural and scientific superiority of the Arabs, at least since the days of Charlemagne, if not earlier. And though the Arabs were already in the Iberian Peninsula, where borders between the Islamic and the Christian world were always porous, there was no transfer of knowledge, much less any translations, in the 9th and 10th centuries, and only some individual attempts at translation of mathematical and astronomical material in the 11th. These activities became a movement only in the 12th century Christian Spain, after the reconquest of Toledo in 1085 and of Saragossa in the north in 1118. The historical reasons of this translation movement become better understood when one looks closely at the question of what the Latin scholars chose to translate from Arabic and why. The historical record shows that the Latin translators of the 12th century looked for their Arabic manuscripts in Al-Andalus, in Muslim Spain, and were influenced by Andalusian tastes and biases in their selection of works to translate. This indicates that one of the reasons, if not the main reason, that they engaged in this translation movement was to imitate the Andalusians, the Muslim Arabs of Spain, and appropriate their knowledge, become like them essentially. That this was among their motivations, rather than any desire to improve their scientific knowledge or advance science, as you would say, is also indicated by the fact that they selected even outdated Andalusian works to translate and did not look around in the Islamic world for the latest developments in the sciences concerned, because theoretically they had an excellent opportunity. Large parts of Syria and Palestine at the beginning of the 12th century were under Crusader occupation, and in Syria at that time there could have been found almost the entire production of Arabic scholarship from the beginning of Islam. But paradoxical as it might seem, and without going into details, Syria was not mined by the Latins for its manuscript treasures. Thus, the translation movement of the 12th century in Spain was a local affair with local concerns and local ideological motivations, which cannot be understood only in the context of the international politics of the time and its attendant ideology, that is, the Crusades. This is because the reconquest of parts of Spain, especially of Toledo, is but a reflection, if not the prime mover, of the Crusader conquest of parts of the Holy Land during the same period. There were intermittent border battles and local jockeyings for power between Christians and Muslims in Iberia, almost from the very beginning of the Islamic conquest in the 8th century, but they acquired a new character by the end of the 11th. They were transformed into a crusade of reconquest by the popes in Rome, who began to grant remission of sins to those who participated in the fight against the Muslims in Spain. These military conquests on the part of the Christians and the newly enhanced ideological climate created an atmosphere in which cultural plunder could be seen as well-deserved spoils of war. For the victorious Christians of cities like Saragossa and Toledo, and for the local bishops who led them and sponsored the translations, the military conquest of the cities by itself could not bring about the prestige which the cities enjoyed under Muslim domination, because what was lacking was the component of superior culture. What was needed was the conquest of Muslim knowledge as well, but not the science of any Muslims or the most advanced Muslim science, but specifically the science of the Muslims of Al-Andalus, and even more narrowly, that of the conquered Toledo and Saragossa. Precisely this sentiment is expressed by an English scholar of the time, Daniel of Morley, who visited Spain in search of knowledge, as he claims, in the second half of the 12th century. After returning home with a precious collection of books, as he says, he describes his experience as follows, and I quote, "Let no one be shocked if, in the subject I am working on, I invoke the teachings not of the fathers of the church, but of the pagan philosophers. For, although the latter are not among the faithful, some of their words, when they evoke sincere faith, should be incorporated in our instruction. We too, who have been mystically freed from Egypt, the Lord has ordered us to strip the Egyptians of their treasures to enrich the Hebrews with them. Thus, in conformity with the Lord and with his help, let us rob the pagan philosophers of their wisdom and their eloquence. Let us rob those infidels to enrich ourselves in faith with their booty." End of quotation. In this remarkable passage, Daniel says that we, meaning the Christians of Europe, have been mystically freed from Egypt, and continues with the metaphor of from the biblical Exodus, with the Christians being seen as the Hebrews and the Muslims as the Egyptians. But what is he actually referring to by having been freed from the Muslims? Given the international political scene in the second half of the 12th century, when Daniel was writing, this could only refer, on the one hand, to the Crusader conquest of parts of the Holy Land, and on the other, to the reconquest of parts of Spain, and especially of Toledo, the city he had visited. The translations from Arabic into Latin of the scientific curriculum were soon accompanied by translations of the same material from the original Greek, though the Arabic-Latin translations continued for a long time to be more frequent and more appreciated. So dominant was the sense that the knowledge to be acquired was primarily in Arabic. Nevertheless, as in the case of the Greek-Arabic translations, other secondary factors were instrumental in the furtherance of the Arabic-Latin translations after the initial impetus was provided by the conquest of Andalusian knowledge. The first universities were beginning to form in Western Europe right after the turn of the 12th century, and the translated text provided precisely the kind of non-ecclesiastical knowledge that the new university scholars needed as the rising bourgeoisie, which they represented, sought to emancipate itself from the clergy. This combination of factors led to the dynamism of the 12th century in Europe and opened the way to the Renaissance. In the transmission from Arabic into Latin, a major role was played by the Jewish communities of Al-Andalus in a philological way, who were instrumental in helping out with the work of translation. However, the historical significance of the acquisition of this knowledge by them is more germane to our subject. Jews living under Islamic rule who spoke Arabic were equal participants in the cultivation and enjoyment of this knowledge, as Said al-Andalusi tells us, who puts the achievements of Andalusian Muslim and Jews in the 11th century on the same level. But for the Jewish communities in Southern Europe, living under Christian rule and ignorant of Arabic, translations into Hebrew were the sole means of access to this knowledge. However, they were also politically dependent on the major empires, just like the Syriac-speaking Christians in the Near East, and hence without need or incentive for a comprehensive translation movement, but only for a circumscribed one motivated by their particular social and community concerns. The translations finally from Arabic and Latin into Byzantine Greek this time have their own special characteristics. It is possible to make a distinction between two phases. During the first, from the 9th century to the Fourth Crusade in 1204, the works translated from Arabic into Greek consisted mostly of what we today call the occult sciences, that is, practical sciences intended to control nature, astrology and alchemy, geomancy, divination, and dream interpretation, and some practical medicine. The more theoretical scientific treatises, and especially philosophy and natural science, were not translated. In addition, the translations were for the most part done anonymously, almost clandestinely, one would say, and as disconnected activities. They did not develop into a complete translation movement that indicated comprehensive commitment by Byzantine society. The reasons, I think, are not far to see. These translations were not made following a conquest by the Byzantines. To the contrary, during this period, the Byzantines were constantly on the defensive against conquest. The translations were for individual practical purposes without acknowledgement either of their theoretical bases or their provenance from the Muslim world. The theoretical bases were of the hated pagan Greek science, and this could not be acknowledged by the Christian Romans. Rumlar. While acknowledging the fact of translation from Arabic would have meant acknowledging the superiority of Arabic to Byzantine culture, which could not be acknowledged either. In the second phase, from the reconquest of Constantinople by the Byzantines in the 13th century to its fall, until the fall of Constantinople, we see translations of Latin theology this time and philosophy into Greek. This time, the Byzantines were conquerors to a certain extent. They took Constantinople back from the Venetians, and they promptly started translating works from Latin. In so doing, they even learned about the Muslim philosophers through the Latin translations used by the Latin schoolmen. And with the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror, we come full circle to Alexander. Mehmed conquered the Roman Empire and saw himself as a second Alexander. The ensuing conquest of knowledge that he pursued involved all the elements in the cultural history we have been traversing. In his court, which contained a scriptorium for copying manuscripts, including Greek manuscripts, there was copied Arrian's Anabasis of Alexander the Great, along with others. By his time, the Byzantines had already translated Thomas Aquinas and other Latin churchmen into Greek, as I just mentioned, and Mehmed now had copies made of the Greek translation by Dimitrios Kydonis of Thomas's Summa Contra Gentiles, thus attempting to include in this conquest the latest intellectual developments, for which purpose he had also translated into Arabic the work of his contemporary Byzantine philosopher Georgios Gemistos Plethon, in particular his Chaldean oracles. But at the same time, Mehmed put the finishing touches to the Abbasid project of Greco-Arabic translations, commissioning the translation into Arabic of Ptolemy the astronomer's geography, one of the remaining works of ancient science that were not translated under the Abbasids. Mehmed's cultural activities brought the Ottomans to the scientific level of the rest of the West and inaugurated a most productive period in their history. I'm delighted, by the way, to see that ever since I mentioned the translations into, after Mehmed, let's say in the Ottomans, there have been a few studies on translations during the Ottoman period, which is really a very great and welcome development, and I encourage more such studies. By the end of the 15th century, therefore, mainly because of empire and the ideologies it fosters or feeds on, the various societies in the world west of India, which formed a cultural unit, had reached, through translation, a common level of higher learning based on the ancient scientific curriculum. The various peoples within the Islamic world, despite their very different levels of cultural advancement at the time of their conversion to Islam, reached the common ground, as did the adherents of the two main monotheistic religions within Islam, speaking Arabic, the Jews and the Christians. The Jews outside the Islamic world did the same through translations from Arabic into Hebrew. The Latin Christian world developed, on the basis of the translations, a similar transnational high culture to rival the intellectual supremacy of the clergy, while Greek Christianity and Byzantium, as keepers of the original curriculum, reintroduced various developments through translations both from Arabic and Latin. Although the different peoples in the empires participated in and contributed to this process to varying degrees, depending on their particular circumstances, political power and ideological orientations, as briefly surveyed, this leveling and spreading through empire and translation of higher learning across such a wide geographical and linguistically diverse area created a truly international civilization and prepared the way for the developments of the following centuries. And I may conclude with a final thought, because seen from this viewpoint of cultural homeostasis, cultural level of equity, more or less, by the end of the 15th century, we can ask perhaps the question that has plagued historians of science and of civilization very much the last 200 years from the right perspective. The question has been asked frequently, as I said, in wrong terms: why did Islam, with such a high cultural level that it had reached by the 12th, 13th, 14th century, and at the same time, the same thing of China. I mean, for those who know the Far East, I'm afraid I don't know anything about it, but this is how the argument goes. Why did they not develop modern science, and why did Europe develop modern science? So the question, of course, is posed wrongly in this fashion and should be posed the other way around. It is not why Islam and China did not develop modern science, but why did Europe? As something that, given this level at which they had all received, what really were the factors, the particular historical circumstances that gave rise to science in the Western Europe, not the West. Whereas, as I said, in the West, as understood, west of India, it should have been the same. So I'll leave you with this question. Thank you very much.
For this excellent lecture. Professor Lucas has agreed, accepted to take questions, and I'm sure there are already questions. There is John Freely in the front row already asking questions. There's a mic.
Is the mic on? Okay. This is a question I've been waiting to ask you since I first read your Greek, your wonderful book. And it is, when I was first studying physics, I thought I'd work my way through to Archimedes. That's a very tough job. You really need a teacher. And so I'm interested in the transmission of the knowledge of Archimedes to the Islamic world. And the question specifically is, where did Thabit ibn Qurra learn his Archimedes and everything else from?
Yeah, I may be the wrong person to ask that, but clearly, mathematical knowledge, to a certain extent, continued throughout late antiquity and in various enclaves, it seems. The precise details have not yet been fully understood, but especially when it comes to mathematics and astronomy-related science, there were developments, of course, in Hellenistic period in Egypt and in Syria, of course. And beyond that, there seems to have been transmitted some mathematical knowledge to India, from India into Middle Persian, and eventually from Middle Persian into Arabic. So there seems to be a continuation of such informal, one can say, transmission of knowledge at that regard. So Thabit, when he came himself to work on the subjects in the second half of the 9th century, he must have had a pretty good grasp of these subjects. And the manuscripts were there, but we don't have specific information about centers of learning. Haran, of course, has been much discussed as being one of these centers, and indeed it was, in the sense that they had maintained as a rule this city, which was of Aramaic, Syriac-speaking people for the most part. They had maintained a pagan culture. They had not converted to Christianity. And as such, they seem to have had great interest in the ancient sciences, which they continue to cultivate. So we have therefore to assume to a large extent that on the one hand, we have local knowledge on mathematical subjects continuing in a place like Haran, or perhaps even coming again from the east via the route, as I mentioned, of India, and figure, but we don't have any specific historical evidence that would tell us that there was this particular teacher before Thabit in Haran who had cultivated the mathematical sciences and everything. But there it is. It was a living tradition. What happens is that with the Abbasid translation movement, things come out in the open, in a sense, and there is an institutionalized attempt to put this knowledge on paper in Arabic. So the people who had been working individually, perhaps, or with individual professors and teachers throughout this area, finally found an outlet which to express themselves, and this is how we get it. So it is not, let's say, that we get all of a sudden this brilliant mathematician, Thabit, coming out of nowhere. He must have had some pretty good predecessors, but because of the particular circumstances of the teaching that was going on, we don't have any specific historical information about that, who it must have been.
Since I have the mic, can I just ask one more question?
Okay.
But it's also about Archimedes, because Isidorus Amylitus, one of the 6-7 guys who was sacked when Justinian closed the academy in 529, they went out to Persia, and he had written commentaries on Archimedes. Is there any possibility that that might have been the beginning of the... also, there is the Archimedes Codex. Yeah. So apparently there was a continuation of studies of Archimedes here in this city through the first century.
Maybe. The question, as I said, this is the problem is trying to find specific historical information to verify things. We can come up with all sorts, as I said, the result shows that there was some continuing instruction going on. But as far as I know, there is no individual historical record of that. We can also assume, of course, manuscripts must have been around because the Arabs translated them. Some of those manuscripts were old manuscripts from the 4th, 5th, 6th century that survived until the 8th, which were translated. Some of those may have been those that were newly minted in Constantinople, transcribed into minuscule writing at the beginning of the 9th century. This is also possible from these things, but beyond that, we don't have any other information about it. But sure enough, your guess, I think, is not a bad one for that point of view.
Professor Gutas, a great pleasure to see you here, especially as a Robert College graduate.
Thank you very much.
Celebrating the 150th anniversary of this wonderful institution. And thank you also for a really rich and extremely evocative lecture. That's most fascinating. Because it is, after all, extremely esoteric material, difficult to approach for those who don't speak or read and write Latin and ancient Greek. But I have two questions. One, you know, of course, that the 0 comes from India, and it got to Europe apparently in the 12th century. So it took a long time to get from India, South India, from the Tamils, through the Middle East to the Arabs, and then eventually through Andalusia, I believe, to Western Europe. So there must have been quite a bit of translation from India in that direction. So do you have anything to say about that? That's the question number one. Question number two is a very different kind of question. One of the great problems in Islam is the great debate between Ghazali and Avicenna, Farabi, the whole question of faith, faith and faithlessness, and so on. Does that have a background in the Aristotelian or Platonic texts? I'm thinking, as a background, of Karl Popper's work on the Open Society, for instance.
I'm sorry, what, the last statement?
Karl Popper's work on the Open Society and its enemies.
Ah, yes.
Which goes into that sort of issue of whether you are faithful or not, whether you have to believe or not. Yeah. After all, this is a very contemporary issue.
Oh, yes.
Right now.
Yeah. Well, the first question, yes, indeed. There were translations from Sanskrit, and as a matter of fact, they seem to be among the earliest translations that were done in the middle of the 8th century, because we have reports, and of course the person to look up this, a scholar who passed away only a few years back, but of course has been tremendously productive in this regard, is David Pingree, who worked really very much on the transmission of the mathematical science, mathematics and astronomy, from any language to any language. I mean, he could read all of those. And it is clear that we have around the middle of with Mansur, as a matter of fact, the Caliph, we have translations of mathematical astronomical treatises into Arabic. And the bibliographers even mentioned the names of a couple of translators, Tanaka or something like this. So clearly there was. Now, the thing is, we do have, especially in astronomical tables, some of these, like the Sindh Hind, which have survived, and historians of astronomy have done their work on this, that this indeed seems to be an Indian system, which then was incorporated into the sciences as they were developed in Arabic. And beyond that, there must have been also other things that are still yet to be investigated and found. For zero specifically, I don't recall having read, or perhaps I forgot it, anything, but certainly the way that you described this is what it does, and the reason it came that you say late is exactly what I'm trying to understand. That is, if the Arabs knew about zero and were already using it, let's say, in the 9th and 10th century, and there were Arabs in Spain, of course, in the 9th and 10th century, why did the Latins did not translate any of those subjects to get it? And this is precisely how I started the investigation. I said, how come the 12th century? All of a sudden, 3 centuries they are there, and all of a sudden one day said, oh, let's translate, you know. So clearly, the political background that I have very briefly to indicate the reconquest, especially of Toledo, which was a great big center of knowledge of Islamic culture, and then of Saragossa, with the concomitant beginning of the Crusades, of course, officially, and having the same ideology promoted by the popes, that anybody who dies fighting the Muslims, whether in the Holy Land or in Spain, gets remission of sins, gave a distinct different kind of motivation to this thing. And the local bishops who were in Spain, who were in charge of the translations, again, they were those in charge of the reconquest efforts as well. So we see this thing. So it was only then they said, well, okay, now that we have conquered the cities, let's conquer their knowledge as well. And they start getting it. So that's why the reason, I think, for the late arrival of zero to Europe. The Ghazali question, of course, well, if I had another 10 lectures, I could go, I could go into that. But very simply, it's an extremely complicated matter, but very simply stated, this has nothing to do with actual historical thing. Ghazali wrote his refutation of philosophy, or actually it is not a refutation. Even the tahafut, the meaning of the word tahafut that he uses means precipitance. That is, somebody who is doing something hastily without thinking it through. So this is actually a philosophical counter-argumentation against the arguments of the philosophers. And sure enough, if one reads, of course, the Tahafut, he says that there is no, only when it comes to say which of their theses are really against religion, that he goes into a religious kind of argumentation. But the entire book, of course, is extremely philosophical, and he's simply trying to show by logical means, by philosophical means, how the arguments of the philosophers on 20 theses are not absolutely correct. That is, they can be correct, but actually they can be false, so we should not really trust the philosophers that what they said is exactly this. Historically, Ghazali's effort had very little effect. As a matter of fact, the vast majority of the people in his area, in Mesopotamia, in Iraq and Iran, they considered him as one of the philosophers, as a matter of fact, and they simply thought that he was a very derivative philosopher. He took everything from Avicenna, basically, and did not pay much attention. In Andalus, they hated him even more because he thought he was trying to introduce a certain kind of Sufism which the Andalusians did not appreciate, and they even burned his book as such. So Ghazali's attempts were really not all that successful in the immediate environment and the immediate century. It was later that he was elevated into that position of being Hujjat al-Islam, being, so to speak, the proof of Islam, and being the renovator of Islam at the beginning of the 6th century of Hijrah, etc. So that is for the historical Ghazali. As for the question of faith versus reason and Popper and the closed society, no, that's modern Western mythology, whatever I should say. It is very much like, I don't know how to give a good example. We start with certain presuppositions which we derive from our own culture, and then we want everything to fit into that. Everything that does not fit, it's bad. I usually give this example of medicine, in that we have our own Western medicine, and then something comes, let's say, from another culture like China, acupuncture, which, as far as I know, it has a certain usefulness to it. But that, of course, is treated as an area that nobody touches because this is whatever it is, it's left out. Because we think our categories of knowledge are such that this doesn't fit in there. So the same way, because the concept of faith versus reason developed in the West, we think the same should apply in the Islamic world as well. Well, it doesn't. There were no more rational beings and argumentators than the Muslim mutakallimun, the Muslim theologians, basically. They'll logic you to death, basically, and you have to be really very much on your feet to be able to counter their arguments logically, and I said. So the question is not faith versus reason, but how were discussions of these intellectual subjects that were discussed by anybody at one point become used by whatever political power is in place for what ends. So I usually say that, for example, we find that the Caliph al-Ma'mun, let's say, he used exactly the opposite. He used this time reason over faith. He said it's good to have reason and bad to have faith, in a sense, because this was his political agenda, which he wanted to have much more political control over things. So he was using, therefore, this understanding put in very simplistic terms for the common people, that reason is good and faith is bad, and using it. At other times, of course, people, and especially with the growing homogenization in most Islamic societies of the political structure, where you would have a ruler, a secular ruler, but always dependent for his survival, basically, upon the local ulama as such. This, at times, of course, gave rise to the use of the same issue, faith, reason, whatever, for other purposes, let's say, to stifle dissent, or to stifle these things. So all societies are closed. There's no such thing as an open society, of course, and Popper's myth, of course, is something else. All societies are closed. Depends, of course, who is doing the closing and what is considered open and what is considered closed. I mean, that's the thing. So very briefly, but wonderful question. I wish I had another 10 years to write, as I said, some book on it.
We have just time for barely a question.
Yeah, sorry.
Dimitri, welcome back to this campus. It's great to see you here, and thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. My question is about the translators. What can you tell us about the translators? Were these people, did these people belong to certain ethnic groups? Did they receive special training for this purpose?
Yeah, depends which translators, where, of all those different translators. The ones that I know best are, of course, those in the Islamic world. And so for the two main centuries of translations that we have, the 8th to the 10th, the vast preponderance of them were Christians, native Syriac, either Syriac-speaking, that is Aramaic speakers, or, in some cases, native Arabic speakers. The most famous of them all, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, for example, was a native Arabic speaker from the south of Tigris, in a village that he came there from Hira. So, but the fact that they were Christians helped in the sense that they would know Greek insofar as they were ecclesiastically concerned and would have to read the Greek church fathers. So Greek was part of the instruction that they received in the seminaries. And Arabic, obviously, they would know because of the situation in which they were, the political situation, of course. So they were the natural people to do the translations. They also, of course, had experience of translating Greek fathers, and to some extent Greek secular works, into Syriac before Islam. So also they had some experience in that regard. As for preparation, this changed over the course of those 2 centuries, in that initially they were just regularly prepared to do their ecclesiastical translations, but as the translation movement continued and gained in prestige, and also those people, I think, started making very good money, as anything, if there is money to be made, people will get trained better. So the translators that we see after the 1st century really reach a very high level of expertise. So the people really learned Greek much better, and they express themselves in much better Arabic, not, let's say, the translationese, which was not considered proper Arabic initially, etc. So this is the situation. For the Byzantine world, we don't really know because they don't talk about it. We have reports of 1 or 2 translators, like Simeon Seth in the 9th, 10th century, but we know very little about him. Perhaps he was a native Arabic speaker that lived in Byzantine territory and knew Greek that well, but it wasn't a school that you can say, or a living tradition as such. We know very little. In the West, of course, we know much better, and some of the better ones learned Arabic quite well in Spain, but also in the West, we have this phenomenon of what I call having shadow translators. Because it was possible to find in Spain, if you want to translate something into Latin, it was possible to find an Arab native speaker who would know classical Arabic well enough to read those texts, and he would translate it into, let's say, some kind of medieval Spanish, local idiom, and then the Christian scholar would take this local idiom and translate it to proper Latin. So that would be proper. So you have translators à quatre mains, as a scholar put it, like people playing piano, 2 people, so we have 2 translators at the same time. So it depends, as I said, on the circumstances where it is, but in itself, this is a wonderful aspect to look into, because again, it indicates us what precise social conditions were available at the time and gives us an insider knowledge into how this went on and such.
Regarding your words on Ghazali and your closing question,
yes.
Do you mean that Ghazali did not have, one way or other, any effect on the answer, possible answer to that closing question?
No, he did not, as far as I know. That is, the question was never posed in such terms in pre-modern Islam, as one of faith versus reason. The question was posed in all sorts of different other ways as to whether you believe that the world is eternal or not. And if you say, of course, that the world is eternal, this means that God did not create it, and there is a problem there, let's say, with regard to Quranic teachings. On the other hand, you could say, well, the world is created, but perhaps it's created ontologically, not temporally, so to speak, and try and wiggle out of it in philosophical and theological terms, which many people did, of course. So the question, as I said, was not put in that sense as stark as we would have nowadays people tell us. So it isn't as if somebody would go to somebody and ask him, do you believe in faith or reason? And unless you said the one or the other, they would put you in jail or cut your head off. This is why we find people studying philosophical subjects way into the 19th century in the Islamic world. Not, of course, with the same intensity in some cases, depending again on the social conditions, but just a couple of years ago, a colleague of yours at Harvard, a young scholar who's coming out, he wrote a wonderful book on logic that was cultivated in the Islamic world in Arabic. And it turns out that there were some Ottoman scholars in the 19th century writing revolutionary works on Aristotelian logic. That far surpassing any had been done before in Aristotelian logic, because by that time, in the West, Aristotelian logic was behind, that they were serving other concerns in logic. So, as I said, this question was never put in Islam at that time. For example, we have examples like Suhrawardi, the famous mystical theosophist, philosopher, what have you, who was executed by the orders of Salahuddin, Saladin, the great anti-Crusader fighter. And everybody said, oh, yes, of course, because Suhrawardi was a philosopher, so, of course, they didn't want to have him. Well, actually, the reason is that Suhrawardi went to Aleppo. At the time, the ruler there was Salahuddin's son, who apparently was not such a great or intelligent person, so to speak. And he came under the influence of Suhrawardi and did not want to listen to the local ulama and what they were saying, and he wanted to do certain things that seemed crazy to the local people. So they complained to Saladin. They said, this Persian philosopher over here, he's creating problems for us, basically. So Saladin had him done away with. So there is always, as I said, some specific issue, political, social, to be looked at, rather than the question of faith versus reason. This, as I said, does not exist as such in Islam. And they have until very late. People studied hikmah, what they called hikmah, meaning philosophy, metaphysics and physics, as well as logic, in schools. And we have biographies of scores of people who they say in the 15th, 16th century, in Egypt and elsewhere, and I studied. And in the, among the Ottomans, the same thing. We find that in the 17th century, people saying that you would not be considered a true scholar unless you studied both the traditional sciences, the Islamic sciences, and the aqliyat, aqliyat as they would say, that is those that were traditional, and the intellectual sciences, including, of course, philosophy. Here, in the up until Lale Devri, up until the Tulip period here, and we have that. So, as I said, so the question was not put in those terms. This is only, again, our categories of analysis and thought being imposed on another culture, not trying to see historically what the situation was.
Before we thank our speaker for the last time, our dean would like to make an announcement, and then we can clap this work.
Well, I would like to thank Professor Gutas for this wonderful lecture. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite all of you to a reception in front of Anderson Hall, in which you can see an installation designed by Professor Benada.
Sağ olun, çok teşekkür ederim. Çok teşekkür ederim, sağ olun. Hakikaten yani...